Next to self, consciousness is one very important word, concept. In Indian spirituality. So, in this lesson, we are going to explore what exactly is this consciousness. When we think of consciousness, we think of consciousness of, conscious of. We are conscious of. Consciousness is consciousness of. Okay. Conscious of these lights. Light. I am conscious of this light. I am conscious of sound. Conscious of smell. Conscious of softness. Conscious of taste. Five senses. We are conscious of these senses. Data from these five senses. From eyes, from ears, from nose, from mouth. We are also conscious of ourselves. So conscious of the sensory data and conscious of the self. Okay, so what is consciousness? Consciousness is of oneself, that I am, and consciousness is of this data. Okay, this is what we think of consciousness. But Damasio, in his book Self Comes to Mind, makes a proposition that about a link between self and consciousness. You know, self is one very important concept. So he discusses the link between self and consciousness. What is the link? See, I had the impression at one time that consciousness is something, self is something else, and enlightenment meant self gets dissolved, but consciousness remains. Enlightenment meant self is gone. Okay. Because after all, it is an illusion. Seemed to be an illusion. Gone. But consciousness remains. So I had that impression before reading Self Comes to Mind. And with that impression, I was about to read. I had not got into it. But I felt Damasio was linking these two. And I felt that Damasio was linking these two because he didn't know phenomena like enlightenment, where self was not supposed to exist. Self won't exist, but consciousness remained. I had that resistance. But as I went along the book, despite that resistance, I came to think, and I was shocked when I understood it, that consciousness and self are one and the same. I was shocked. How consciousness and self are one and the same? This is how I reasoned. Let me summarize. Consciousness is conscious of this and self. Suppose one is a blind. Can he be conscious of light? No. One is dumb and deaf. Conscious of sound? No. Suppose he was given certain ambience where he is deprived sensorily, then he will not have the touch also. And still he will be conscious. So it means there is a possibility where you may not have any sensory data, but still be conscious. Blind, dumb, deaf, tactile, deprived. He will not have sensory data. And still, he will have the feeling that I am conscious of self. So it means what is significant to consciousness is not the sensory data, but the sense of self. So, consciousness is primarily not consciousness of senses, it is consciousness of self. If consciousness is not there, sense of self is not there. If sense of self is not there, consciousness won't be there. So I reasoned that what is essential to consciousness is sense of self. So they can be equated. To summarize, consciousness is primarily consciousness of self. Consciousness is self. Consciousness is sense of self. That is, sense of oneself. That you can also say subjectivity. So, this also reinforces the earlier lesson that there is nothing like dissolution of self, because dissolution of self is loss of consciousness itself. Self should not be and cannot be dissolved, because that amounts to loss of consciousness. And that is why when a part of brainstem is damaged, there is no sense of self, which means there is no consciousness also. And when anesthesia is given, sense of self is lost, consciousness is lost. there are no dreams. There is no self, there is no consciousness in deep sleep. Okay. So, consciousness is self. Okay. Then we can introduce two more variables of consciousness. One, levels of consciousness. Waking state is a higher level. Deep sleep, very low level. Dreaming, little higher than that total dreamless. These are levels of consciousness. A psychology book discusses levels of consciousness. That is one. So, levels of consciousness are nothing but levels of self. Fully awake, less so, dream. There is another dimension. That is contents of consciousness. Contents means there is consciousness, but what is it that is conscious of is content. I am conscious of light, that is content. Conscious of touch, that is content. Conscious of my feeling, content. Conscious of this particular event, I am thinking, conscious of thought, that is content. So, contents of consciousness are different from levels of consciousness. That is different from simply consciousness. Consciousness is a quality. Content is what is there in it. Level, how intense it is. Carries vegetables. This bag is consciousness. Vegetables, contents of consciousness. Consciousness is this quality of seeing, holding. Contents, what it holds. Take an analogy of vision. What one sees, the quality of seeing is the bag. But what it sees is the content. I see the light, I see the camera, I see the fan. These are the contents of vision. But what is vision? My ability to see. I can hear, but what am I hearing? The noise, music, what the other person says. These are the contents of my hearing. So, consciousness is quality. What it contains is contents. Okay, level is a different dimension. Okay, so consciousness is self. This again reinforces the lesson, earlier one, that is self-dissolution cannot be the target, because self-dissolution is ending of consciousness itself. So, we are with that question, what might be the truth behind the idea that self is an illusion? So, what is that illusory nature about the self that we need to understand? We will look into that.